Hi students, this is Ms. Young. You have been selected to be in the Civil Rights Group for the Progressive Era Project, Donate to My Progressive Cause. So in this video, I'm going to give you some background knowledge about what the civil rights struggle looked like during the Progressive Era, as well as some suggestions for you as you're completing your project. All right. So your group's goal is to get your Progressive Era classmates to donate their money to the cause of eliminating civil rights injustices for African Americans. So first I wanted to provide some background on threats to civil rights during this portion. Now we already have quite a bit of background knowledge on that from our Reconstruction unit. So you already probably have a few ideas, but I just want to provide a little bit more context around some specific threats, especially more in the era that we're discussing now. One of the big threats to civil rights was a Supreme Court ruling in 1896 called the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. And on the slide on the left, you can see the actual legislation that was passed by the Supreme Court. Homer Plessy was a man, and this might sound familiar from the Edpuzzle, who was he was taking a train in Louisiana and was forced to go to another car, like a Jim Crow car, and he sued, and it made it all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court decided that segregation was legal. The Supreme Court specifically used the phrase separate but equal. So what the Supreme Court meant by that was as long as you had facilities that were separate but of equal quality, then segregation was constitutional. Now, we know that this led to segregation. It kind of enshrined segregation in law. And we also know that these facilities were not equal. I think in the Edpuzzle video, they mentioned that it would be incredibly costly to maintain two separate and equal facilities for everything: education, healthcare. To divide society in half like that and provide two services of equal value is incredibly costly and not possible. So not only is it discriminatory, but the idea is just not practical on a financial level. So this legally enshrines segregation, and then also leads to kind of the deteriorating quality of these separate but equal facilities. So during the civil rights movement, Plessy versus Ferguson gets passed, but there's a significant struggle for civil rights during this era. So first I want to talk about a couple of prominent leaders during the Progressive Era that are pushing the civil rights movement forward. The first is Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington founded the Tuskegee Institute, which is still in Alabama. He founded that in 1881. Booker T. Washington was originally from the South. He was born into slavery, and his kind of focus was on academic and vocational training for African American students. The picture on the slide shows African American students at the Tuskegee Institute. I believe this picture is from a history lesson. How appropriate for this class. So Booker T. Washington really believed in industrial skills learned through education. And he argued, sorry, my little toolbar down here is hiding this. He argued for the improvement of civil rights through economic equality. So Booker T. Washington had this philosophy that economic equality had to come first. So he really argued for economic empowerment for the African American community, and that from that, civil rights would follow. Another prominent leader of the Progressive Era civil rights movement was W.E.B. Du Bois. W.B. Du Bois was a Northerner. He was originally from Massachusetts. He was college educated. He attended Fisk University here in Tennessee. And he also, I think, got an advanced degree at Harvard as well. He was the editor for the Crisis newspaper. You can see the first volume published here in November 1910. And he was also a founding member of the NAACP in that same year, in 1910. We'll talk about the NAACP a little bit more on a subsequent slide. W.E.B. Du Bois had a different philosophy of civil rights from Booker T. Washington. W.E.B. Du Bois was a scholar and a writer. He had attended very prestigious universities, was very academically minded, and he argued that civil rights would come from political empowerment for African Americans. So W.E.B. Du Bois was focused more on politics and how that would lead to civil rights, while Booker T. Washington was more focused on economics and industrial skills and how that would lead to civil rights. So they had two kind of differing views of how to attain civil rights during this period. Now, like I said, Booker T. Washington was one of the founding members of the NAACP. And so when you are appealing to the class, your progressive era classmates, to donate their money to your cause, you want to give them a concrete organization that they can donate to. One organization is the one that Du Bois helped found, the NAACP. So the NAACP was founded in 1910. The NAACP stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And they chose the term colored people intentionally, so that Du Bois' reasoning was to include all different ethnicities of more of like a darker race, which would be what they called it back then. So he was trying to be a little bit more broad and inclusive when naming it. The goals of the NAACP were to end segregation, discrimination, disenfranchisement, and to end racial violence, particularly lynching. Now, this map, and you do have to include a data source in your presentation, and this map could be something that you include. This map shows mob violence, which is another way of describing lynching. Lynching is mob violence, between the years of 1881 and 1918. So that fits within our time frame for this project. Remember, we can't go past 1919 for this project. And so the dots on the map represent instances of mob violence during this time. You can see there's a little key in the bottom right-hand corner that also breaks it down by ethnicity. So not just African Americans are lynched during this time. That's predominantly the group that is affected. You see most of the dots are orange, which corresponds to African Americans, but there are also Italians, Native Americans, Latinx. Other is the teal color, and Chinese as well. So those dots represent the mob violence in that time. Something else that you might want to address if you choose the NAACP as your organization that the money would go to is, what are some steps that the NAACP was taking? What action were they doing to try and eliminate civil rights injustices during this time? One example are protests. This is a picture of the silent protest from 1917. In 1917, there was a race riot in Illinois. There was some violence against African Americans in East St. Louis, Illinois, and police responded to the scene, but they weren't really doing much. And in the scuffle, 2 police officers were killed, and this set off a race riot against African American citizens in East St. Louis, Illinois. So there were 48 people that were injured, a few people that were killed, and lots of African Americans driven out of their homes, or their homes were burned. So in response to that race riot that was against African Americans in East St. Louis, Illinois, the NAACP organized a protest. There were 10,000 people that showed up. They marched through the streets of New York completely silently, and the only sound was the beating of muffled drums as people marched and carried signs in protest. Another potential organization that your group might decide your money might go to is the National Urban League. And so the NAACP this was the outgrowth of W.B. Du Bois. It fits a little bit more with his focus on political rights. So a protest in the streets, the silent protest, represents kind of this political focus. Whereas Booker T. Washington and the National Urban League is more kind of focused on economics. So that might be the organization that you are asking your progressive era classmates to donate to. Now, a reason that economics was a focus during the time that we're discussing is because the Great Migration was happening, okay? So the Great Migration started in like the mid 1910s. So this map specifically states 1916 to 1930. However, since the Great Migration began during our time period, which ends in 1919, it does technically fit in our timeline because these trends were happening starting in like the mid 1910s and through 1919, which is the cutoff for this project. Now, what this map shows us is African Americans moving from the southern states into new locations, seeking out opportunities, fleeing racial violence. So there's a lot of reasons that they're migrating. Thinking back to those push and pull factors that we talked about in our industrialization unit, they apply to internal migration within the US as well. One thing we talked about during the Reconstruction was African Americans moving out west. And so we do see a trend. They say many of the exodusters eventually left Kansas and Oklahoma for California. So we have that trend of the Homestead Act, the Transcontinental Railroad, helping people move out west. But the majority of the Great Migration, African Americans are moving up to the East Coast. We see a strong presence in East Coast cities as well as Midwestern cities. And so that's where the National Urban League comes into play. They're responding to the trends that are shown in this map. So the National Urban League was founded in 1910, and it was formed in response to this influx of African Americans migrating to northern cities from southern, more rural areas. The goal of the Urban League was to improve economic, social, and spiritual conditions of African Americans in urban areas. And the image on the left is like their founding document from 1910. When African Americans arrived in these northern cities, the National Urban League worked to help locate jobs and housing for them in their new cities that they moved to. So this could be another potential organization that your group talks about. That's kind of more associated with Booker T. Washington, while the NAACP is a little bit more associated with W.B. Du Bois. So overall, your group's goal is to advocate for your fellow progressive era classmates to donate their money to the cause of ameliorating civil rights injustices during the progressive era. I'm really excited for this topic. It's really rich and there's a lot of great sources, and I think your group is going to do a great job.